Once again, I'd like to warmly welcome everyone to today's webinar, and each of our 4 presentations will last for 10 minutes long. And I would like to invite you all to post any questions that you may have for the speakers in the chat with the name of the speaker you would like to direct your question to. And at the end of all 4 presentations, I will direct your questions to the speakers, and we can have our Q&A session at the end of all 4 presentations. To start learning about our guest speakers' exciting research from around the world, we'll first start with Dr. Laura Costadone from Old Dominion University, USA. Dr. Costadone is an assistant research professor at the Institute of Coastal Resilience and Adaptation in Norfolk, Virginia, USA. Her work focuses on bridging the knowledge gaps between science and practice to streamline the implementation of nature-based solutions in urban and coastal planning to address major environmental, economic, and societal challenges. With that, I invite Dr. Costadone to speak to our curious audience.
Thank you so much, Dishan, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today. Am I able to share my screen?
Yes, you can.
Sorry, are you guys able to see my screen?
Now we don't see your screen. No.
Now?
It's loading. Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, thanks. So as Dishan mentioned, the main focus of my research is really like harnessing nature for implementing climate resilience. So as we all know, climate change and urbanization, they pose a threat to cities and challenges, including air pollution, urban heat island, flooding, and in case of coastal system, also like sea level rise and erosion. But they can also offer opportunities, especially when it comes to nature, a nature-based solution to address some of these challenges. And the core of my work is really like to implement nature-based solutions to build climate resilience. And for those of you who may not be very familiar with nature-based solutions, are actions to address societal challenges through protection, sustainable management, and restoration of ecosystem. Basically, is about leveraging the power of nature. But nature-based solutions, they also provide a lot of more benefit because they offer different ecosystem services, including, but not only, climate change adaptation and mitigation. They provide green space for recreational opportunity, but also for urban regeneration. They can help with water management, air quality, and also coastal resilience, for instance, in case of dune restoration. However, when we want to design and plan in nature-based solutions that they really need to be tailored to the local need, it's very important to have a deep understanding of their effectiveness and to capture all these ecosystem services and co-benefit. So very often I've been asked by local community to conduct like cost-benefit analysis to really assess the economic viability and benefit that these nature-based solution can provide, especially compared to gray infrastructure. Because unfortunately, very often, like local government or decision maker tend to still prefer like implementing some gray solution because they don't perceive all these co-benefit and ecosystem services. So evaluating all these benefits is really important to build confidence in investor, buyers, but also like in the local communities. Unfortunately, there is still like a lack of standardization in the methods. So here in coastal Virginia, and especially in this Hampton Road region, the problem is linked to flooding because unfortunately this is the area across the US with the highest sea level rise. in the East Coast. And so the City of Virginia Beach implemented this sea level wise program, which is a comprehensive initiative to really boost the city resilience to flooding. And they are proactively integrating nature-based solutions across the cities. So I've been asked by the city like 1 year ago, basically when I started working here, to conduct a more like comprehensive study of the benefit provided by one of their project. And this is supposed to be one pilot study, so we can like put together a methodological approach that can be then expanded to other nature-based solution projects. So I put here a map of the US, and I apologize because I assume everybody knew where Virginia is. Is southern of Washington, D.C. And the project area is really like in the core of the city. And is this city-owned golf course of approximately 55 hectares that is located in the city center. And the golf course was surrounded by neighborhoods that they are characterized by a low elevation. And so these were really impacted severely by compound flooding, so rainfall and storm tide. So here you can see the golf course as it was like before the project, and here is just like a map of the project just to give you a better idea. Basically, they're going to transform where all the grass is. They will put this big pool that they will help retain water. It's a sort of like a multi-tier storm water park or a sponge park, if we like to call it that way. And so for these studies, I look at a more comprehensively, try to capture different ecosystem services and benefit to capture these ecological and socio-economic benefit that this park will provide. And I look at temperature mitigation using the EVMED software. Of course, flood mitigation, this analysis was conducted with the help of the engineering firm. Ecological benefit, including pollinator, and environmental quality using the hedonic price method. So for the flood mitigation, and here is just like a cut drawing of the project, we can really see that the golf course will create additional water storage with those big pools that they will build. And so the model predicted a reduction of approximately 50% in structural flooding and approximately 20% in the roadway flooding. Then I look at the ecological benefit, and here is a picture of the planting palette. We can see that they are really going to plant a lot of like trees, and all is going to be native vegetation. And I use two indexes, the Shannon and the Simpson indexes, that are common metrics to measure species richness and evenness, and also relative abundance. And the conversion will basically increase significantly the plant diversity between the golf course and the stormwater park, which is not really a surprise. This is really like in line with many other studies. But also I look at the pollinators abundance using the INVEST model, which is part of the big INVEST modeling suite that was developed for the Natural Capital Accounting project. And the model basically estimate the pollinator supplies based on the availability of nesting and floral resources and relative abundance of the different pollinator species. And so the index between the golf course and the stormwater park will increase by more than 55%, which is very important because these indicate this park will serve as a significant hotspot for biodiversity and pollinator, which is also one of the main goals of the project, is really like to provide a hotspot in the core of the cities. And also it will be habitat for birds and other wildlife animals. I look at temperature mitigation using the ENVIMET, which is a tri-dimensional software for microclimatic simulation of complex urban environment. And here we can see that more tree and more vegetation can reduce the temperature by up to 5 degrees Celsius, just because, as we know, trees are more effective in reducing temperature than grass. It is particularly relevant because the cooling effect will manifest in the afternoon during the hottest hour. And there's going to be, the model predicted about 2 to 3 degree difference in areas that will be designed with a walking path. And finally, we look at the overall environmental quality and amenities, and we use the hedonic price method, which is an economic method to estimate ecosystem and environmental services that can be that can directly affect the market price. So the average price of the house within a 1,500-meter buffer from the park is about $274,000. The presence of the park will increase the price of the house by about 4.5%, which is more than $12,000. And so since there are like about 400 houses within this buffer, we consider the total housing appreciation will be almost $5 million, so which will increase the revenue for the property tax for the local government. So why this study is relevant? Before, this is really like a comprehensive methodological approach that can really support the implementation of future net-based solution project. Particularly because it can help building public and political awareness of all these co-benefit that this type of project can produce to the society. Because nature-based solutions are really like ecological asset that can really support the society and the economy. And so it's very important being able to measure and to capture all these ecosystem services so that will be hopefully easier for decision-making to select more and more of this type of project instead of the gray infrastructure. Thank you so much. And this is my email for any other question.
Thank you, Laura. That was such an interesting presentation, and it was quite a lot of information you have put into a concise slideshow, and it was really interesting. Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Lukas Lamb-Wotton from Tulane University, USA. Dr. Lukas is a postdoctoral research fellow at Tulane University, where he's working with Dr. Dan Fries and primarily developing field-based questions related to carbon fluxes in Mississippi River Delta mangrove ecosystems, but has wide-ranging interests in coastal ecosystem ecology that span multiple spatial scales and include field-based and remote sensing techniques. He recently completed his PhD at Florida International University in the United States, where he broadly studied coastal marshes and mangroves, but mostly focused on understanding patterns of salinization and marsh loss across the South Florida coastal Everglades. Dr. Lukas Lamb-Wotton, please take away the audience.
Hey everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Deshani. And thanks for inviting me. This is cool to be a part of. Okay, let me see if I can. Slides. Okay. Now I'm gonna go into this and tell me if you. Okay, wait. I think I need a. Are you seeing the slides or the notes?
It's still loading.
I'm able to see them.
Okay, but it's the slides because I have the screen and I never know which one it's sharing. But I think it's okay.
Now it's the notes.
All right, cool. Okay. I'm slow. Oh, it's because of that. Look at that. Okay. All right. I think I got it. All right. Okay. Cool. So now it's not the notes. Now it's the actual slides.
No, you have to stop sharing and then reshare after you work it out.
I don't know.
We see your slides, but it's showing the next slide also.
Yeah,
there you go. Put that in presentation mode.
Yeah, okay. I think I just need to blow there. Now it's good.
No, it still show. Oh, there we go. Got it.
Okay. All right, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. Cool. So yeah, as Shani said, I just I finished my PhD like back in April, and I was working down at FIU, in Florida International University. Sorry, mostly working on coastal marsh loss, or kind of the vulnerability of them and patterns of salinization. So today, I kind of like to take on kind of the point I'm trying to make with these slides today is that really just since this was an early quick career webinar, I figured, as early career researchers, we need to kind of be thinking about how to, I don't know, kind of push science forward. I mean, we're just starting our careers, and so it's kind of like thinking not like outside the box, but kind of how you can, I don't know, like push networks forward, I guess. I don't know. I had this idea in my head and I've been trying to think how to word it. But anyway, so just to set the stage for where my work started, I was working out in the Florida Everglades. This is South Florida. Miami's down here in the corner. But really, in the last 100, all you really need to know about the Everglades is that in the last 100 years, really, once kind of colonizers or kind of people that look like me started arriving there and building up infrastructure, they decided to drain. They wanted to drain this whole land, right? So the Everglades used to basically be all of South Florida, starting up in this area of South Lake Okeechobee, where you have this really slight elevation gradient, which kind of gives this like imperceptible overland sheet flow, right? So you get this really huge connected wetland landscape where eventually this fresh water is reaching these coastal areas on the southwest and the southeast coast of the tip of Florida and draining into the ocean. But in the last 100 years, with all these canals and levees and all the drainage we've done, we've built up this urban corridor and really forever changed the hydrology of the system. And that has big implications for salinization, right, in coastal wetlands, right? This fresh water moving into the coast is essentially kind of keeping a pressure on the ocean and limiting the amount of seawater that can just intrude landlords. So when you remove all that fresh water, you allow this saltwater intrusion to occur. And then when you couple this with sea level rise that is currently ongoing and it's going to keep going, this kind of sets up these conditions for these big landscape level transitions and losses of ecosystems. So there's kind of like, so all my work was kind of nested within the Florida Coastal Everglades Long-Term Ecological Research Program. This is a program that started in 2000, kind of around the time when a lot of these kind of like Everglades restoration was really starting to get into gear, and a lot of these programs and plans were starting to be developed. So just to kind of a brief overview of the sites or the network, it's really composed of two transects. We have the bigger Shark River Slough or SRS that is kind of a conduit of fresh water that's draining fresh water into the Gulf of Mexico. And then we have the smaller Taylor Slough, which is draining into Florida Bay down to the southeast coast. And we have long-term sites, field sites along each transect, right? So, and they're kind of covering these I guess kind of the most dominant characteristic ecosystem types of the landscape, right? So we have kind of these freshwater sawgrass dominated marshes, that's SRS 1, 2, and 3, TS 1, 2, and 3. And then we have mangrove forest and within the estuary, where these can be really tall riverine mangroves as well as kind of more scrubby mangroves. And those are SRS 4, 5, and 6 and TS 6 and 7. And then we have some seagrass sites, and that's TS 9, 10, and 11. So this program, I mean, it's really kind of opened the lid on the ecosystem or ecology of the Everglades and really just elucidated all kinds of local scale processes as well as really large landscape scale dynamics that we really wouldn't understand very well without this program. So my research was really focused on looking at these like more not freshwater, but brackish sawgrass marshes. And so I kind of have this bullet, and it's kind of like what I was alluding to is that, and this it's something that I was thinking about at the time, right? This is kind of an idea that upon reflecting of my time as a PhD student that I kind of hope happen, where I kind of established new research sites and within this network that are kind of these satellite sites that are ecosystems that are not really represented by these sites, but that is where the process that I was interested in was going on. So we needed to look outside of these long-term sites. And so this is like one of these kind of, I guess, the original satellite sites that I started to work at. We call it the Brackish-water site. It was the location of a large in situ mesocosm experiment that was ongoing when I started, right? And this was a saltwater dosing experiment because this is a sawgrass marsh. And like we have some FCE sites that are sawgrass marshes, but they're freshwater marshes. So this is a brackish marsh. And sawgrass it's really a freshwater plant. It can tolerate moderate levels of salinity, but once you get up into the 10 to 20 ppt range, it starts to get stressed and just be less productive. And that was kind of one of the things that we learned from these experiments is that threshold for productivity declines with increasing salinity. But for my PhD, I wasn't necessarily interested in continuing on in the experiments. I wanted to look outside the experiments and start developing field methods in order to characterize these marshes that were at risk for sawgrass declines, which ultimately drives peat collapse or elevation loss, and then transition to open water, as well as to then be able to kind of understand from a broader vulnerability perspective where on the landscape these marshes were most vulnerable to collapse. So I kind of developed a bunch of survey methods at this site. And then I wanted to replicate these surveys at additional sites. But again, these sites weren't, the FC sites weren't characteristic of these kind of hydrologic conditions. So, oh, I forgot that was it. So I basically went out and oh, that's weird. Oh, it's next slide. Okay, so I went out and kind of put up. So this is, you can see this is the brackish site. It's this lower star, and then there's this other freshwater site, which was another experimental site that was ongoing. And then SH1 was a USGS site that is really close to SRS3, so it's also a freshwater sawgrass marsh that we basically inherited from USGS. But then I went out and I established these two newer sites, which the labels are flipped, and it's really driving me crazy. But I went out and essentially built out these, what I call these hydrogeomorphic monitoring sites. So I built boardwalks and installed instruments or the apparatus needed to monitor elevation change long term, so surface elevation tables, and then installed wells to monitor hydrology. And then this allowed me to then conduct these surveys and just collect data across more characteristic marshes that were at risk for salinization and collapse. Right. So it's kind of just, so I kind of hope that I laid kind of the foundation for, new students or other researchers then go out and work at these sites. So just kind of building upon what is already at the FC, but giving them additional sites to test other processes. Because additionally, we have these there we go. One of the other things I talked about, this kind of larger scale coastal vulnerability analysis that I was working on. We had this big hydrodynamic landscape scale model that's simulating like surface water and groundwater conditions at high frequency temporal scales and somewhat poor spatial scales. And I wanted to use this in order to test, where are the hydrologic conditions existing or currently present that are conducive of collapse. However, within the model, the sites that were, the data that they were using to calibrate the model was really from all of these open water channels. You can kind of see the rivers right here and in the bays. And we didn't really have any marsh sites for this model to calibrate. So it was kind of hard for me to have a lot of confidence that for sure that these hydrologic conditions were representative of the marsh. And based on some preliminary data collected, I was kind of hesitant. So, now these sites exist and they can be used to help calibrate this model, and hopefully other folks can go and do more work there, because I'm not there anymore. And that's kind of, I guess, the last thing I was just going to say is just mentioning some of the other things that I'm working on now. Because now, my PhD was very Everglades focused, and, as early career researchers, I'm really trying to expand my just understanding and experience working in different systems. So I've been kind of focused on Mississippi River Delta here, and focusing specifically on mangroves, which are not super abundant because we're at the northern range limit for mangroves. But I've just been kind of reviewing these, what's been done, and trying to develop some flux studies and looking at these vegetation changes across some barrier islands, right? So it's just kind of a whole different system, and it's been fun to kind of put my head somewhere else. I'm also kind of trying to expand out and go more global scale. And so I just think it's important, as I feel like I just said this, as early career researchers, just to continuing to think, more broadly, how can we continue to expand our skills and work in new places, because it's only gonna, benefit us in the long run, and just help figure out what exactly it is that you want to do. So that's really it. That's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luke. It was such an interesting presentation again, and it's really nice to see the amazing work you have done in the Everglades again. It's nice. Thank you. Once again, I remind the audience.
I'm totally.
Yeah, was it Lucas? Okay.
I say I'm totally in the marsh right now. That's all.
You really are. So once again, I would like to remind the audience to post your questions in the chat. And at the end of all four presentations, we're going to have a Q&A session. Now I'm going to invite our third speaker, Dr. Merav Cohen from Israel Institute of Technology. Her presentation is titled, What Can We Learn from COVID-19 About the Principles of Resilience in Socio-Ecological Systems? She studies this topic by utilizing long-term socio-ecological research platforms in a comparative analysis of place-based mixed method case studies. She's broadly asking the question, what prepared some communities for the COVID-19 pandemic more than others? She has conducted a comparative study in collaboration with socio-ecological research platforms affiliated with the ILTER and LTER networks to examine whether generalized principles which have been associated with socio-ecological systems resilience, such as diversity, redundancy, modularity, and social capital, contributed to their capacity to endure and manage the pandemic. In this webinar, she is going to share her team's methodological approach to this work and some preliminary findings of this work. Merav, please take away the audience.
Thanks so much, Dashani. And thanks for the upgrade. Not yet a doctor in the works. I'm a PhD candidate at the moment. Let me quickly share my screen, hopefully with no issues. Let's see. One second. Put this here. Make it small. All right. How's that? All good? Can you see my slide?
Yeah, all good.
Hopefully. All right. Well, hello, everyone. And thanks so much, Dashani, for the warm welcome to join this group. My name is Merav Cohen, and I study what makes the social ecological system more resilient, examining resilience theory through the global disruption of COVID-19. Hold on one second. Let me just time myself here. There we go. So the work I present today was made possible with the support of course, my advisor, my mentors here at YASA. I'm calling you from Vienna, where I'm at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis at the moment. And of course, with the help of contributors both in Taiwan and in France. And I'm going to show you more about this now. So our main question is really what attributes, social ecological attributes, can strengthen or weaken a society's resilience in the face of a major unknown and unpredictable crisis. And this is going to be a very, very strong segue away from the two other presentations we just saw. Okay, so this might be very different and hopefully interesting for many of you who are focused on the ecological elements of the system. But before diving in, I really want to make sure we're on the same page because resilience is a very slippery concept. And it's used differently in different fields. So our working definition is that a system is resilient if it has the capacity to cope with disturbances without losing most of its defining functionality, right? And resilience is often studied with regard to a specific place and time and a particular disturbance, right? So like the resilience of rice fields in Thailand to flooding, or the resilience of indigenous population in Alaska to climate change. But there's a growing body of research that aims to try and generalize things to get us more prepared for the unknown. So these attributes or qualities which have been recognized in the literature include reference to the structure or the composition of a system, like diversity or connectivity, as well as the stores of its components or competencies of the system to conduct a certain activity like learning and innovation. And these examples are the principles that I focus on in my study. And this is based on a key literature review that I've conducted. And really, there are different sets in the literature. Each of them, they overlap to some extent. But I chose to focus on the ones that have been most established in the literature. So just kind of putting my best foot forward, focusing on principles of resilience that have been more established in the literature. And if you're interested in this, if you're a resilience buff, then stay tuned because that's a publication in the works. So my work addresses two main gaps with regard to these resilience principles. And first, identifying COVID-19 as an opportunity to validate them across different social ecological systems because they all deal with the same shock simultaneously, right? So that really we haven't had this opportunity in our lifetime. right? And then the second one is that resilience research traditionally focuses on the ecological part of the system, aiming to preserve, the biophysical system like this lake or forest for the benefit of humans, right? But here what we're trying to do is really encapsulate human society as a component within a single holistic socio-ecological system. So looking at how we interact with the biophysical world, how we organize within our environment, how we use it, and how this may shape our experience of the crisis, right? So with this main question in mind, here again for your reference, we essentially try to get a deep understanding of how COVID impacted the local, how these principles played a role in building or weakening our resilience to these impacts of COVID-19. That's essentially the question. And to do this, we decided to conduct a comparative study of 3 locations, 3 diverse social ecological systems. And these are defined regions for long-term socio-ecological research, or LTSCR platforms. Some of you may not be familiar with this terminology. These are platforms that include LTER sites, but they encompass both the social and the ecological aspects of the research. So while this research doesn't really use long-term data series, it is our affiliation with this network, both in Europe and internationally, that really enabled this collaboration, finding access to data, building upon local knowledge, long-time relationships with stakeholders, and also, of course, to translate the research and contextualize it for each of the locations. So this is kind of the comparative potential of this type of study. I'm going to give you a brief overview of our process. So we started with one-on-one interviews, aggregated the results, reflected this analysis back with some background data back to participants in a group setting for discussion. And then, as this image suggests, this was completed for 2 out of the 3 participating sites. And I'm going to give you a glimpse into some of our initial results from the Taiwan location and the French location. More specifically, if you're interested in participatory processes, the way we did it is we produced a set of causal loop diagrams. Essentially, these are mental maps that we drew together with the stakeholders during the interview to identify how they perceive the local impacts of COVID, what may be the connections between them, and possible drivers or mitigating factors. Okay, and then we used Mental Modeler to do this. Not a perfect tool, but did the job. And you can imagine that these look very different from participant to participant, and these are just a couple of examples from Taiwan. You can see even without reading, you can see how difficult this may be to aggregate. So in aggregating this, things got fuzzy. And that's, if you're not familiar with this, the difference between a causal loop diagram to a fuzzy cognitive map is that you put weights on nodes and connections between them. So basically what we ended up with is a fuzzy cognitive map that shows us the level of agreement about particular impacts or factors and the links between them. So we have a core that is of high consensus, a middle level, and of course the fringe, which are issues that were raised only by a mere few. And then this is what it looks like in Taiwan. So we excluded the lowest level just to make it more manageable, and so that we would be able to reflect it back to the participants. In the French platform, the story was very different. The map was a lot more dense despite having less participants. It was very difficult to work with, so we had to kind of change our approach, and that's okay. I'm at peace with it, but really focusing on central nodes, drivers, and receivers when we develop this conversation with the local stakeholders. All right, I'm going to move a little faster now. We also collected the data, as I mentioned, both with regard to COVID impacts and with regard to the characteristics of the place, with the idea that we will be able to reflect back to the same participants, not only how we understood their, not only our understanding of their experience, but also some hard official numbers. And then based on that, generate a discussion to deepen our understanding of the central narratives, get their feedback on our map. But also, and this is an important point, the second important objective of this was really walking the talk of transformative socio-ecological research. So the interaction among the local stakeholders, sharing the knowledge, building relationships between them, and getting that aha moment when they learn something new, right? So when they realize how this tool can help them get a better understanding of the system. So now we're at the crucial point of analysis, where we ask, how did these principles really emerge from these collected narratives, from the combination of the data, of the transcript of the meeting, and the aggregated map that we adjusted after the feedback? And these are our initial observations in Taiwan. Just to give you an example, this following a network analysis of the fuzzy cognitive map. So we found that there was a strong impact on tourism, for example. This is just to show you how we extract these narratives. And with tourism being really a pillar of the local economy, this highlights the need for diversity, right? This is just one example. Diversity of the business sector. And the central role of low population density and close community, or the media, and minimizing contact all reflect the resilience principle of optimal connectivity, finding that sweet spot where we're connected, but not too much. And the importance of social capital is also expressed through this emphasis on close community as a supporting mechanism against the fact that it's also an aggravating factor. So when we look at the minimizing contact. And then fear and mental and emotional health in general came up very strongly at the tail end of all this. So we'll be examining these a lot more closely. And lastly, having sufficient amounts of vaccines, for example, can indicate having reserves, right? So this is this one here, like reserves of stocks, of funds, of relationship, capacity to manufacture, et cetera. And then, whoops, sorry, coming to the end. And then the ability to adjust our business in view of the reality of COVID shows us the capacity to learn and innovate. So this is how we're thinking about this, extracting these principles. So last slide. What would this look like when compared across 3 sites? Stay tuned for that. I look forward to sharing final result with you maybe in the future. And I just hope that this presentation may have inspired you to take advantage of the opportunities that these networks provide for your own research comparatively, because standard observations are being composed and this network holds even greater potential moving forward. With that, I thank you so much for the attention and welcome you being in touch with questions and suggestions and insight.
Thank you, Merav. And it was another interesting. You said it's different, but it's the whole point of bringing in the early career researchers together to learn about what you guys are doing in different parts of the world. And it's really interesting. And thank you for sharing with us. Our last speaker in this webinar is Dr. Anabel Vonjackowski from Microbial Observatory Laboratory in France. Anabel is a Swiss scientist who, after graduating with marine science bachelor's degree, where she had the opportunity to explore everything from shrimp aquaculture to whale anatomy, decided to focus on microorganisms. And I'm going to hand over the audience to Anabel to talk about her current focus of research.
Thank you so much. You guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks so much. We've gotten a great insight into the Everglades and COVID, but today I want to take you on a little journey into the ocean and how we're using long-term ecological research sites to understand the changes in the ocean on a long-term scale, but also specifically my research is on seasonal dynamics in the ocean. So climate change, as many of you are surely aware of, are affecting our entire planet, but more specifically specifically, it is particularly affecting the Arctic region. And looking, for example, at the global means, see surface air temperature that has increased in the last couple of decades. We have also seen, along with that, an increase in the global sea surface temperature. And so in the brown, you see kind of the historical model, back model temperatures. And then in blue, you see an RCP of 2.6. So that is kind of if we kind of stopped emissions now and we got to net zero emissions by the end of the century, whereas the red projected line, and hopefully not what is going to happen, but kind of the business as usual model. And so we see that both the global air temperature, but also sea surface temperature are going to rise significantly in the next couple of decades. So how's that affecting the ocean? That is really important and to understand, because actually the ocean has two different ways of kind of storing carbon temporarily and permanently also. So the first is kind of this physiochemical carbon pump. So CO2 dissolves into the ocean and then can form intermediates as carbonate and bicarbonate in the ocean. And then the kind of more permanent one is the biological carbon pump. So again, we start with carbon dioxide that dissolves in the ocean that is then used by phytoplankton. And through photosynthesis, they not only produce oxygen, but they also produce these carbon products. So one is this semi-labeled dissolved organic carbon, which is kind of all your dissolved carbohydrates and amino acids that eventually end up feeding heterotrophic bacteria in the ocean, but they also produce this particular organic carbon. And that's actually just more of a definition difference. So the particular organic carbon is much larger and it can form these aggregates that eventually sink, but also are food for zooplankton. So all of your higher trophic levels here, ranging from fish to polar bears, have just kind of been lumped in one big term, but also these eventually through, for example, if whales die, contribute to exporting carbon to the deep sea and also the sediment. So not only do we have kind of this change going on, but then on top, we also have seasonal differences that are also affecting the ocean. So it's a very complex system that in the last has only been observed pretty recently, to be honest. So first kind of time series started in the 1900s. So the most kind of common methods are these discrete devices. So you have different sensors, for example, for conductivity, temperature, and depth. And then around that, what you see on the picture on the left here are these bottles that can be closed at individual water depths to bring those back up and then be measured on board a research vessel, for example. And then you can also sample the sediment with these called box cores that are very heavy, and you bring them down to the ocean, and due to their weight, they press into the sediment, and then you close them at the bottom, and they bring back the sediment to the research vessel where it can then be sampled. So these are more these discrete devices that really use a lot of manpower or womanpower to sample. And then there are also these continuous and autonomous devices. So there's actually a really cool diversity of different instruments that are used. You have these crawlers, which are kind of like your mini Lego cars that roll across the seafloor and take different samples. There's these landers, which are big kind of steel devices that also have different sensor loads. You have your remotely operated vehicles. You have moorings, which are kind of fixed on the bottom of the ocean and then have these have a wire that goes into the water column and then also has different sensor loads. And then you also have AOVs, which are kind of these kind of underwater drones in the ocean. So both the autonomous and the discrete have different time and spatial scales that we can sample. So with, for example, the autonomous, we can go down to almost a second of measurements, but you have to you can only look at a very narrow range in terms of spatial scales. For example, in the discrete time series, you can measure a long distance, and because you're, for example, on the research vessel, you drive and then you take samples and then you continue and then you take another set of samples. However, because they're very labor intensive, the time scales usually only go down to a day, but then if you repeat those, you can sample up to years. So if we look at their distribution in the ocean, you can see that the ship-based time series, they're much fewer, and they're also more like located in the Northern Atlantic, whereas these autonomous time series are located all over the world, globally. So as I just said, the majority are in the Atlantic, then followed by several stations in the Arctic Ocean and the Baltic Sea. And across all of those, the sampling frequencies range anywhere from once per day to multiple times per year. And this is different for every single station in the ocean. So today I wanted to show you guys two examples, one from the Arctic Mediterranean, as it's also called, and the actual Mediterranean Sea, because they're very similar in their oceanography. So they're both surrounded by land masses. They have Atlantic inflows, they have deep water outflows, and they have a strong river influence. And both are, the similarities also in terms of change are temperature increases, marine heat waves, Atlantification, which is an expansion of the Atlantic water masses. You have changing precipitation patterns and also loss of land through the ice melt that is happening in the Arctic Ocean, and then flooding, which is occurring in the Mediterranean Sea. So the one long-term ecological research station that lies in the Fram Strait, which is between Svalbard and Greenland, is called Hausgarten, and that is operated by the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. And then now I'm working on the Microbial Oceanography Observatory in Banyuls, so that is located in the Gulf of Lyon in France. So if you look at the Arctic Ocean, research from several centuries or from the past decades has shown that you have diatoms that bloom in the summer, and also kind of this Phaeocystis boucheti, which is a different algal group, and that has been rising possibly due to climate change. And both of these, we don't know specifically which of those, but they release this food, the semi-labeled dissolved organic carbon, more in the summer. So when the phytoplankton bloom is stronger, and when it eventually dilutes, you have less of that in the ocean. So you have more food for the bacteria in the summer and less later in the season. So that makes a lot of sense. What is interesting to note, though, is that a recent study from Von Appel et al. In 2021 showed that the year where I sampled in 2018 was actually an abnormal year, because normally you have this like slow progression of the phytoplankton bloom as the ice melts. But in 2018, the ice melt was so severe that the phytoplankton bloom happened all at the same time. And so maybe this is more of a projection of kind of the new Arctic, what is happening. So then this semi-labeled dissolved organic carbon is feeding the different types of bacteria actually, and these change seasonally. And because the Arctic is so remote and far away, we only get 1, maybe 2 samples a year. And so I've then since moved to France, and I'm doing a postdoc here. And what's really great is because it's more coastal, we have a lot more opportunities to sample multiple times a year, several months. So again, you see kind of more diatoms bloom in the first part of the year. So here the first bloom actually occurs between December and April. And then you actually also have a second bloom, again, different. So these are actually autotrophic bacteria in the later part of the season. And so again, here we have a shift. Now we have a much higher temporal resolution of the semi-labeled dissolved organic carbon. And we can also not only looking at the bulk concentrations, but also differentiate between these dissolved hydrolyzable amino acids that are more phytoplankton derived, and then the other ones, which are these amino acids that are more bacteria derived. So we actually have this shift in the composition throughout the year. And again, we see, similar to the Arctic, we see a different composition in the first part of the year, and then a shift to more of these generalists later in the season as well. So we really see some similarities, although the phytoplankton types differ. And what this work has shown in the last couple of years is that microbial parameters unfortunately require shift-based sampling. The phytoplankton exudates control bacterial activity and composition throughout the year. The higher resolution time series that we've been able to sample in the Mediterranean Sea has given us more insights into the monthly dynamics. And what I really want to emphasize is that ecological and biogeochemical measurements are both needed to understand microbial dynamics in the ocean. So yeah, thank you so much for your attention. And I want to thank my PIs from these two research organizations and all the funders.
Thank you so much, Anabel. That's quite the diverse range of topics we had in our webinar today. And it's, for me, myself, it was a whole new area of research that I learned from your presentation. Thank you so much. Now we have about a couple of minutes for Q&A session. We thank you for posting your questions in the chat, and thank you, speakers, for answering them. We can bring up some of the questions that if any of the speakers would like to elaborate on it, but first let's give the audience a minute to ask their questions from our speakers. I see a question for Merav, and I would like to have I have a question related to that. I see that you have posted about, you're gonna study about similarities and differences in these different communities. Do you have any preliminary findings on what kind of similarities or differences you would find in these three communities, or whether the different political systems have a different say in your findings?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, and I wish I could tell you that I chose these sites because, oh, they're so, exceptionally uniquely different in the exact same, like I designed it just right, but I didn't. So it's really interesting to see what comes up. I wanted different places. I was collaborating with whoever was interested and available. So these, for example, so the region in Taiwan and the region in France are both very rural and sparsely populated. So they both rely heavily on, you can imagine, agriculture and tourism. And so they were impacted in a relatively similar way because of their strong reliance economically on these two things. But they had the resilience because they were producing their own local foods, right? So in both situations, we see a shift into local food production. So there wasn't so much stress there as you may find, in New York City, for example, or places which were really impacted by that, by the supply chains, right? So then we see a shift to local production of food. But what was interesting to see is that the difference between the policies in these two places impacted their indirect impacts of COVID, right? So in Taiwan, there was less strict social distancing policies and lockdowns than they had in France. And so in France, there was a strong narrative of fake news and resisting government and this social uprising and distrust of the government around that, and isolation and mental health narratives. Whereas in Taiwan, they didn't suffer so much from this isolation. And so they had, that narrative was less strong. In Taiwan, however, we saw the population is very much aging. So they felt very strongly the return of the young people to the region because they lost their jobs in the city, and how that really helped them, the elderly aging population, to cope with COVID-19 when the young people came back and jump-started new initiatives for new businesses, et cetera, and supported the elderly. So that's like the diversity of the population, diversity aspect of resilience.
Thank you. We have a question from Jan. Would you like to ask a question, Jan? Unmute yourself.
I would, if it's possible, I would like to initially ask Merav a question, but it's actually a question that may be relevant to all of our speakers today. That we all of us study, as you have done, two populations, France and Taiwan, and we've seen Florida and other places. And I'm always concerned about the knowledge that we learn in one place and how relevant it is to the whole big wide world. Now, the modeling, etc., is one way of doing it, and your maps, for example, and pulling through to different main variables. You could then take these to other places and see if they still fit. Like you could determine the differences between France, as you've just explained, and with Taiwan, and pull out your main barriers or main influences, and then do a survey and check in Scotland whether how people felt on a sliding scale, for example. And there are other examples that we've seen from this morning. Some of your models, you could parameterize your models, look for other places. But as scientists, we tend to be funded in a particular place for a particular question. We answer it and we move on. And it's up to another scientist or a policymaker over here to read that work. Do any of you have any great ideas how we can change this model of science? I know it's maybe a wee bit of a big question for early career scientists, but you're supposed to ask bright young minds things. So I'm asking you.
I'll answer briefly, just from my personal experience. So, I've been affiliated with the European network, the LTER network, and we've established collaboration in Taiwan just through this conference and the ILTER network. So I feel like I've been funded by LTER and by the research initiatives grant of the international network, the ILTER. So I feel like these type of international umbrella organizations providing this type of seed money for PhD students to collaborate with other PhD students is really, really important. And I'm based in IIASA now, the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, and it's doing exactly the same thing. So it's an international organization, so you're naturally collaborating with people from all over the world, and the funding is through this organization. So I guess my short answer is international organization funding, supported by your local institutions.
I have a brief comment because my research is quite different, and you can tell it's quite site specific, and I'm more like really interacting with local communities. So in this case, I'm really trying to develop and put together a standardized methodological approach that can be easily replicated anywhere else. And I'm like, for instance, collaborating with the municipality in Southeast Asia that they are trying to capture the same, cost-benefit analysis. And so this approach is, of course, depends on the data you have, but it can be really applicable everywhere. So that's why we can export these, not the result, but the way, to capture these ecosystem services.
And by the way, Jan, you have these type of international organizations everywhere. Even the Stockholm Resilience Center. I mean, yes, it's based in Stockholm, but they don't just deal with local issues, right? The Resilience Alliance or...
No, you are right. And for those of, I know Mer quite well, but when we had our Scottish independence, the organisation I work for is in England and in Scotland. And I was thinking we could become an international organisation if only they'd voted for independence. Sorry, I take it.
Thank you, Jan. Anything else Luke and Anabel would like to add to it? Oh.
I mean, yeah, I guess I would just say I definitely don't have an answer for that question, but it's definitely something I feel like I think about because coming from the Everglades, and starting to work in other systems, I've come to find or realize how unique that landscape is from, when at least for mangroves, when you think about global scales, there's like these geomorphic and sedimentary characterizations, and the Everglades really fits into this kind of unique place. But people are still trying to compare them and just compare. It's just a matter of scale, I feel like. But in order to do that, right, yeah, it requires the right funding. And I mean, I'm in a position where I'm just on a startup, so I can really just kind of, we can do whatever we want, which is great, but not everybody has that. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like it just takes persistent thinking over time, at least from early career research. I feel like you plant that seed in your head in the beginning, and then 10 years, 20 years down the road, you just keep thinking about it over and over, and then eventually maybe you have an answer. I don't know.
So the ocean is a huge ecosystem, the largest, I would say, on the planet. However, for example, SDG 14 has received the least amount of funding in the last couple of years. So funding has really been an issue. And as a result, a lot of different bottom-up organizations have been built over the different years that, however, do similar things. And so what I'm really seeing is that we have a lot of these ecological research sites that are doing similar approaches and doing similar things, but they're not communicating to each other. And so what I say the next step would be is to have a global database, like all the one map I showed where you see all the different long-term sites in the ocean, like I manually put that together. So because there was one data database that, however, due to funding, got discontinued like almost 10 years ago. So that work was already done once. And now kind of you have to redo it. And like, you know, it works pretty well for these autonomous different instruments. Like each instrument had, like the moorings have their own database and the buoys have their own database. But for these discrete samples, there really isn't right now. So I think like putting all the data we have right now together, and then what you can do really nicely is do these meta-analysis, because what's happening right now is if I wanted to compare my data to, I don't know, a different site in Australia, I would have to contact or try and figure out who the contact is of that research station and then ask them for their data. So it's not very transparent right now. So I think what's really great though is that in the scope of the UN Ocean Decade, which is happening right now, a lot of this change is being facilitated and it's being moved forward. And by the end of the 2020s, we'll have a very different view of the ocean than we might have had just even this year. So.
Awesome. That's very insightful from all of our speakers. And I would also like to say that that's really why we need to push through with this ECR network within the IITER. We can make a strong network. This is just the beginning of our network. We can do many more events to build a stronger network and promote collaborations within different fields of research and also within similar researchers to share data and expertise. And with that, I would like to thank all 4 amazing speakers today and for all of you all for participating in this webinar. And thank you all. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing everything.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Pleasure meeting you all.
Yeah.
Yeah.